Maintenant, cette séance, bienvenue dans la réunion numéro 101 du Comité permanent des transports, de l'infrastructure et des collectivités, la Chambre des communes, conformément à l'article 108.2 du règlement et la motion adoptée par le comité le lundi 20 novembre 2023. Oh, on va juste arrêter là pour s'assurer qu'on a la traduction.
I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 101 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities pursuant to... Okay, I'll start again. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 101 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, November 20, 2023. The committee meets to discuss on its study on the accessible transportation for persons with disabilities. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application.
Although this room is equipped with a very powerful and sophisticated audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to our interpreters and cause serious injury. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to a microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of our interpreters, I invite participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged and avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they are not in use. Appearing before us today for the first hour, colleagues, is from Air Passenger Rights, Dr. Gabor Lukács, President, joining us by video conference. Welcome back, sir. Always good to have you here. And from the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority, we have Nada Seman, President and Chief Executive Officer. Welcome to you. Louise Arborelli, General Manager, Operational Programs, and Rhoda Boyd, Director, Communications and Passenger Experience. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Lukács, to begin with your opening remarks. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Mr. Chair, honorable members, Air Passenger Rights is Canada's independent, non-profit organization of volunteers devoted to empowering travelers. We speak for passengers whom we help daily in their struggle to enforce their rights. We take no government or business funding, and we have no business interest in the travel industry. The right to accessible transportation is enshrined in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, to which Canada is a signatory. Accessible transportation is also a matter of common sense and compassion, affecting millions of our fellow Canadians. For example, 1 in 10 Canadians have a mobility-related disability, and 1 in 14 a vision-related one. Disability rate increase with age. 2 out of 5 Canadians aged 65 or older have at least one disability. If you don't have one yet, you may develop one sooner or later. Yet passengers being deprived of their mobility aids or of adequate assistance in air transportation and having to crawl on the floor as a result is sadly not a new problem. The advance of technology has brought to Canadians' living rooms the footage of the all too common inhumane treatment of passengers with disabilities. These incidents can no longer be ignored. Canadians deserve an answer why these incidents keep happening and what needs to be done to stop them. The culprit is the perennial problem of inadequate enforcement and inadequate legislation. The Accessible Transportation for Persons with Disabilities Regulations, ATPDR, codifies important principles, but was not written with enforcement in mind. It does not stipulate clearly defined, predictable, and significant financial consequences for violations, nor does it offer automatic compensation to affected passengers. While the Canadian Transportation Agency fined Air Canada and WestJet in a few high-profile cases with significant media coverage, consistent and strict enforcement is lacking. The fines in high-profile cases were in the right ballpark of $50,000 to $100,000. However, when the media is not paying attention, the fines are insignificant. Last week, Air Transat was fined only $11,000 for a similar violation. These fines are just the tip of the iceberg. No statistics are available in Canada because, unlike the US, airlines are not required to report any data on mishandled mobility aids or disability-related complaints they received. The ATPDR itself also contains harmful loopholes. The most significant loophole is the exclusion of international flights from the one-person, one-fare rule. The one-person, one-fare rule prohibits airlines charging an additional fare if a passenger requires an additional seat for disability-related reasons. This rule is vital for providing equal access to air transportation to passengers who must be accompanied by a support person due to their disability, or who are too large to fit into a single seat, or who rely on a service dog. In 2008, the CTA imposed the one-person, one-fare rule on flights within Canada as a measure to eliminate undue barriers to the mobility of passengers with disabilities. Since 2008, however, the CTA has rejected every attempt to expand the one-person, one-fare rule to international flights. The CTA incorporated the one-person, one-fare rule in the ATPDR, but excluded international flights from this important rule. In 2022, the CTA refused to hear a complaint seeking to expand the one-person, one-fare rule to international flights, citing incompatibility with Canada's commitments to other states. These concerns about Canada's international commitments are devoid of any merit. Canada is not only entitled, but also has an obligation to impose requirements on airlines operating to and from its territory to implement Article 9 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the right to accessible transportation enshrined therein. Since the CTA is failing at protecting passengers with disabilities, it falls upon you, the lawmakers, to do so. I ask that Parliament repeal subsection 31(2) of the ATPDR and pass legislation that enshrines the one-person, one-fare rule for all travel within, to, and from Canada. Thank you.
Very much. And just to confirm, and I should know this because you have appeared before committee multiple times, the correct pronunciation of your last name for the benefit of our members here.
It's Lukács, like you catch a ball.
Lukács, thank you so much for confirming that. Next, we'll go to the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. Bonjour et merci de m'avoir invité à joindre à vous aujourd'hui. Je m'appelle Nadia.
Thank you for inviting me. My name is Nadia Semen, and it's an honor to appear before this committee as President and CEO of the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority, CATSA. I'm joined by Rhoda Boyd, Director of Communications and Passenger Experience, and Louise Abarelli, General Manager of Operational Programs. I believe everyone knows that CATSA is responsible for securing specific elements of the air transportation system. We have 4 mandated activities: pre-board screening of passengers, hold baggage screening, non-passenger screening, and restricted area identity cards. We deliver the mandate of security screening at 89 designated airports across the country through a third-party screening contractor model. Our goal is to provide professional, effective, and consistent security screening across the country, combined with a focus on service excellence. As part of this commitment, we strive to provide an inclusive and barrier-free security screening experience for those who work at or transit through Canada's designated airports.
Ongoing improvement is actually always at the forefront of CATSA's efforts. With this in mind, we saw the Office of the Auditor General's recent report on accessibility transportation for persons with disabilities as an opportunity to look at what additional steps we could take better to meet the needs of those we serve. Personally, it was actually a great way for me to focus on such an important topic just a few days after my appointment as CEO of CATSA. And we definitely agree with the recommendations made as a result of the report, which provided additional measures we can undertake to remove barriers for persons with disabilities. The report contains 3 recommendations for CATSA, and they were areas for improving accessibility of online content, implementing enhanced accessibility training, and leveraging complaints data to prevent barriers to accessibility. So today I'll give you a little bit of an update as to where we are in these areas. On the first recommendation, we have taken critical steps towards ensuring our online content meets web accessibility standards. As planned, we upgraded our content management system. Since then, we've been working on an ongoing basis to ensure outstanding website accessibility issues are addressed. Right now, we expect that these improvements will be completed by March 31st, 2024, providing an enhanced level of accessibility on our website for all travelers. With the regards of training, we have implemented a process to monitor and ensure that all screening officers receive accessibility training prior to starting with the work in the public. The CATSA management and decision makers are immediately offered accessibility training upon joining the organization, and that they complete it within a set period of time. We also introduced 3 new modules, which for both screening officers, managers, and decision makers are required to complete, and all of employees are encouraged to explore. We're also working to improve the data gathering and analysis of CATSA's complaints. More specifically, we are improving how we categorize complaints to allow us to extract more accurate data. At the same time, we are enhancing our reporting of these complaints. As noted by the Office of the Auditor General, we currently evaluate and process complaints individually. This allows us to review complaints in real time, share information and feedback to our frontline operations right away and to our training team. However, to improve our reporting, we are creating a quarterly report that will allow us to better analyze our data and identify potential trends that we can work to address. CATSA actively listens and engages with passengers, airport workers, screening officers, the CATSA workforce, and accessibility advocacy organizations to identify, prevent, and eliminate accessibility barriers, both current and future. In fact, my colleagues and I had the enormous pleasure of meeting the Chief Accessibility Officer recently, where we voiced our support for the work, very important work that is being undertaken by her office, but also our commitment to continued collaboration. We remain available to participate in various forums dedicated to common goal of taking action today to work towards a more accessible and barrier-free tomorrow.
Even with all the progress accomplished by CATSA towards accessibility, this is an area where we will always continue to strive to do better. We believe everyone deserves and is entitled to an inclusive and barrier-free experience. Thank you for the opportunity to invite us to speak today on this important priority. We'll be happy to take any questions on our role in travel and accessibility. Thank you very much.
We'll begin our line of questioning today with Mr. Strahl. Mr. Strahl, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for appearing on a very important study. I think Canadians have been very troubled by some of the high-profile stories that we've seen in the media, including starting with the Chief Accessibility Officer having her wheelchair left behind on one of her flights, which I think kind of was ironic and unacceptable, and led to a focus on this issue, which I think is a very important one for this committee to delve into. I want to start with Mr. Lukács. We've all seen the stories of passengers that have been forced to drag themselves down the aisle of an aircraft or lift themselves up exterior stairs. Both of those incidents, those 2 high-profile incidents, perhaps the most graphic incidents in the last number of months. One occurred in Las Vegas and one occurred in Mexico. I guess my question to you is, how should the government of Canada, through regulation, and the airlines be forced to address this issue, and what are the complications, or should it matter at all, when these incidents are happening to Canadian passengers on Canadian carriers but outside of Canada?
Thank you for the question. In my view, it is immaterial where the incident is taking place as long as it is a travel to and from Canada. Air travel does not have jurisdictional borders in the usual sense. A flight starts in Canada, ends somewhere else. The fact is that these are carriers that are licensed to operate to and from Canada, and as a condition for their license, they have to comply with Canadian law, including Canadian human rights legislation. So it is essentially the airline's responsibility to ensure that its staff members, its subcontractors, whoever it is entrusting to handle passengers, are complying with the Canadian law that the airline is required to comply with.
Another issue is, in addition to these passengers that were subjected to humiliating and unacceptable boarding and disembarking processes, we've heard numerous cases where, you know, a wheelchair or a care aid is not the same as a piece of luggage. This is essential to a person with disabilities continued their ability to live life to the fullest. When you damage a wheelchair that costs sometimes in the tens of thousands of dollars, or it doesn't arrive and someone is thrown into an airport wheelchair, it's obviously unacceptable. What do you believe the solution is to ensure that these disability aids are not treated like a Samsonite suitcase and are in fact treated as an extension of the person with a disability, and given a priority where there's just no chance that these highly specialized pieces of equipment can be left behind or damaged? What is the response of government to ensure that simply cannot happen for persons with disabilities who are traveling?
I agree that the mobility aids are extensions of the person with disabilities body. That's a very important message that unfortunately is not sufficiently passed on to those staff members who handle those mobility aids. There is no foolproof solution. Right now, aircraft are not necessarily equipped to transport those mobility aids in the cabin, which would be the perhaps perfect solution, although it may be an aspiration for coming years to move in that direction in terms of engineering and what may be safe and possible. What certainly can be done in the short run is to impose very significant automatic and immediate financial consequences, over $100,000 per each such incident that happens. Once there is a high price tag, the airline will work much harder to prevent that type of financial consequence.
I'll move now to Katsa. I'm interested to know how your ability to serve Canadians with disabilities is impacted, if at all, by the size of the airport that you are operating in. If you have a couple of agents who do a few flights a day, are you still able to offer the same service to persons with disabilities, or is it more difficult in those smaller or regional airports as opposed to the majors where you have hundreds of staff and all of the perhaps the latest equipment and technology and ability to perform your pre-flight checks in a dignified way for a person with a disability? So can you just talk to us about the challenges that you might face based on the size of the airport you're operating in?
Actually, we have standard operating procedures throughout all airports, so we do provide a very consistent method. Does size of the checkpoint help in terms of mobility? Absolutely, but we always make sure that when we're designing it, that there is easy access for all passengers to get through, regardless of the size of the airport. We do work with the airport authorities. If we ever hear anything that if there's ever a complaint or anything, we would address it immediately. I'm not aware of any issues in the smaller airports that actually would hinder persons with disability to go through in any way. And like I said, our standard operating procedures and all of our training, it's done by CATSA, even though there's different service providers that we go through in the third party. So we try to ensure consistency no matter where it is.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Mr. Yakino. Mr. Yakino, vous avez 6 minutes. À vous la parole.
All right, I welcome the witnesses this morning for being here to enlighten us on these incidents. So, passengers with disabilities who use mobility aids, specifically those with wheelchairs or scooters that require certain kind of tools to adjust, face inconsistent application of policy on whether they are allowed on the plane or not. What is the policy, and can you tell us how that is communicated to your frontline staff in terms of inconsistent application of this policy? And I recall more than 10 years ago when I was traveling with my mom, she didn't have much of a disability, but we took precautionary measures to get her from the beginning of her entering the airport to the plane to be transported by a wheelchair so she wouldn't get fatigued. So we were the ones to instigate that we needed that type of a service. So what happens now, today, with somebody that has a disability XYZ? The moment they go and purchase a ticket, what are the questions asked to them? What are the procedures that follow right up to after that? And where does this information go after that? Like, who does it connect to, and who reacts?
I can't speak to what the airlines do when a ticket is purchased in terms of what happens. I can speak to, though, what happens when they reach the airport to the security lines, if that helps. I do know we do share data but we don't share specific data on who's coming. They share data in terms of the load of passengers so that we have the right amount of staff for security screening. In terms of our processes, the minute we see anybody that requires any kind of assistance, whether it is a mobility aid or not, we do have family special needs lines in the smaller airports, actually.
Aren't you the one giving guidelines to the airline companies? They have their own procedures, but is there any set guidelines that come from your part to how they should be reacting towards?
No, I believe the Canadian Transportation Agency might have guidelines, but CATSA does not have any regulatory or oversight on any of the airlines. We actually just provide, and I don't want to say just, we provide security services to ensure the security of the traveling public when they get into the sterile area.
So when you have a passenger who is hard of hearing or completely deaf, how do you communicate with them?
Well, actually, we do have training on that sometimes in terms of, and I'll ask actually Rhoda or Louise to talk to the actual training and what we do. So if either of you want to jump into that.
Yes, so thank you for that question. So your question is, what happens when a passenger with hearing loss presents at a checkpoint? As Nada has mentioned, we have very detailed standard operating procedures that our screening officers follow when dealing with passengers, and our procedures are very specific and also address passengers with special needs.
Okay, so thank you. So you do have somewhat procedures in that case, but you don't have any procedures set out when it comes to people with disabilities? Is that what I'm understanding?
No, we have actually procedures for people with mobility that require mobility aids. We have some with vision loss. We also have instructions on how to handle equipment such as defibrillators or things like that. We also have procedures on hidden disabilities, those that you don't necessarily see. We've also, in all of our training, and I mentioned in my opening remarks on the training, the new modules, for example, that we put forward, some of it actually, and that training has people with the disabilities, they actually provide us their lived experience, what they saw in it, and they say, this is what would be done. If you could do this, it would be better. And we're finding that training is really helping crystallize what we really need to do to improve, because we try our best, but we also know we can always improve.
Okay. So what is the complaints procedure for passengers with disabilities who have an issue with CATSA?
We have actually our independent complaints. She's in charge of all of the complaints, so I'll let you, Rhoda, speak to it.
So we have complaints procedures. Oh, thank you for the question. We have complaints procedures that go through our client satisfaction team. So anybody who has questions before they travel, if they have a complaint having gone through security screening, it comes to that team, and we address every accessibility complaint as a top priority. They're given attention immediately, and any questions they may have,
Okay.
we address those immediately.
So thank you. I see that you have somewhat of a system. So why in these two cases that system didn't work at its best?
I'm sorry, those two cases were with airlines, not with CAXA.
Okay, and you guys have nothing to do with that? You don't communicate with the airline companies? You don't work together, or you're two different entities?
We are two different entities. We work together, but we're two totally different entities. We provide security
So don't you
screening in
think that-
airports.
But do you ever communicate with them? Is there any other fields in your job that you do that you communicate with the airlines?
We're actually very happy to work with all the airlines and the airports on an end-to-end solution for all travelers, including persons with disabilities. That's something we would love to do.
Merci, Monsieur Iacono. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Barcelou-Duval. À vous la parole. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
6 minutes to the next speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses who are with us today. These are frustrating issues when we look at what's happening in the media. It's frustrating to see that people with disabilities year after year find themselves confronted with the same problems. And I'm looking at news articles that are from 2009, 2010, 2020, 2023 even. It's like the same problems keep coming back year after year. People who have reduced mobility always seem to have difficulty getting services. They seem to be treated in a cavalier way and by the airlines. So I would like to know, and maybe we could start with Mr. Lukács, is there a specific reason why this is happening? Elsewhere are things done differently elsewhere in the world? Should we be inspiring ourselves or looking to what other countries are doing in this area?
Thank you for the question. When we look at the United States, what I can say that is different there is statistics and public reporting of statistics. You can just go on the website of the DOT and find daily statistics monthly on lost, damaged mobility aids. So it doesn't remain secret what the airline has done. In Canada, we should implement a similar system, perhaps with enhanced statistical reporting of disability-related complaints that the airlines themselves receive. As for other matters, the one person, one fare rule has been a pioneering effort in Canada, and I don't think we should be looking at other countries. On the contrary, we should set an example and be international leaders in accessibility, in expanding the one person, one fare rule to all flights, not only within Canada, but also to and from Canada.
Merci pour votre réponse. Ça m'amène peut-être ailleurs, justement.
Okay, well, thank you for your answer. I was reading an article not long ago that there was encouraging news for people who were going to be able to board planes in wheelchairs. Currently, there's a certification process for certain chairs that can go into the planes, but that process is in the United States. And in Canada, Canada would decide to apply it if the United States decided that it was a good thing to do. So my question is, should we always be kind of waiting for the United States to act in terms of our legislation?
No, we should not be trend followers. We should be trend setters. Canada should be a world leader in accessibility and transportation. We should be setting the trend. We should be setting examples and let other countries follow us. So just because the US may be lagging behind on some of these issues, that is not a valid excuse for us not to do everything to meet our Canadian values of accessibility.
Merci. Merci. Dans votre allocution d'ouverture, dans vos commentaires.
Thank you. In your introductory remarks, you referred to the United Nations and how people with disabilities should be treated and their rights should be upheld. Now, in your initial remarks, I wonder why you didn't talk about the OEC. Sorry, the interpreter did not catch the acronym. So a certain legislation. He's talking about a certain legislation.
I'm afraid I didn't hear the legislation you were referring to. It was not getting through the translation.
Donc, c'est difficile pour moi de savoir qu'est-ce qui n'a pas été traduit, par exemple, pour vous, là, parce que
it's difficult for me to know what wasn't interpreted, but my question is, when you talked about your standards, you referred to standards or laws dealing with the UN, but with the organization, the International Aviation Organization in Montreal, they too set standards, and they recommend that countries sign to follow those, and Canada is a signatory. So are there standards of that aviation organization that should be explored or further applied? Is Canada doing an adequate job of following them?
Thank you. Now I understand the question. The airline organizations.
Je comprends la question. Les organisations d'aviation.
They are setting normal standards for the airlines. Parliament's role is set the standards in law. So the airlines have to follow what Parliament is setting, and not airlines should not be dictating to Canada what the laws on disabilities and accessibility should be. Certainly looking at other sources as inspiration as authority is a great initiative, but ultimately Parliament is sovereign, and Parliament has the authority and should be telling the airlines what are the human rights standards they have to meet if they want to do business in Canada, from Canada to Canada.
Merci.
Thank you. Regarding the concept of one person, one fare, so you only pay once per person to go on a plane, you're saying that in Canada, to your knowledge, it's applied for transportation domestically, but there are no other countries, but not to other countries, because Canada seems to respond to that request that actually Canada would have to communicate with its international counterparts to establish standards like this, but that it's not something that is standard internationally. Do you have any examples elsewhere where it's being applied, or are you would we be the first ones to do that?
We're going to have to wait for a response to that, Mr. Lukács, for the next round. So if you can hold a response, that would be greatly appreciated by Mr. Barcelou-Duval. Next, we'll go to Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Dr. Lukács and the team at CATSA for being with us today. We're here as a committee because I think largely because of the atrocious, dehumanizing, and harmful treatment of people with disabilities by Canada's airlines. And I sincerely hope that this committee can produce a report with strong recommendations that can lead to real changes that result in better treatment of people who fly on Canadian airlines. I do note that Mr. Lepofsky from the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance was supposed to be with us as a witness, and unfortunately he had technical issues with his sound. I hope that the committee can have him back. I think he'll bring a very important perspective to this study. I'll start my questions with Dr. Lukács. And Dr. Lukács, you've been an outspoken advocate for air passenger rights writ large. And I wonder if you could start by drawing some parallels between this government's approach to air passenger rights and this government's approach to regulations around the treatment of people with disabilities who travel.
The parallel that I'm seeing is concerns about inadequate enforcement and inadequate legislation. There is, however, a difference when it comes to rights of passengers with disabilities. At least the government is showing some good intentions, while I could not say the same thing about passenger rights. So in the case of disabilities, I would say it is more a question of poor implementation and not direct deliberate sabotage of the implementation of policy. Enforcement has been a concern. It is also something that has been identified in the Auditor General's report, although I don't believe that just lack of resources explains the low amount of fines that was issued, for example, to Air Transat, while the cases with significant media exposure get very significant fines.
What do you think does explain it?
The explanation is that there is some intent of virtue signaling. There is some level of differential treatment based on political desires, as opposed to simply looking at violations and having a standard, consistent enforcement of a particular undesirable behavior.
Now, Dr. Lukács, you mentioned the one person, one fare regulations and the fact that they, the airlines do not feel that they extend to international flights. There was recently a ruling in BC Supreme Court on this topic where the court found the opposite. Can you comment on that ruling and what implications it might have?
We are talking about a preliminary ruling that threw out WestJet's challenge to a lawsuit about the one person, one fare rule. Passengers were suing because they had to pay extra on international flights, in particular, because WestJet is not following the one person, one fare rule for international flights. That's a preliminary ruling that is paints a very damning picture about the Canadian Transportation Agency's efforts to avoid dealing with the one person, one fare rule on international flights. They're playing essentially hot potatoes and referring to non-existent international obligations that don't in any way tie Canada's hands as an excuse for their inaction.
Now, you mentioned WestJet. We're going to have the CEO of WestJet appear in our second hour. How would you describe WestJet's record when it comes to the treatment of people with disabilities?
Unfortunately, we don't have systemic statistics, so I would be a bit hesitant to paint them with a broad brush. Certainly, the fact that they are trying to fight the one person, one fare rule on international itineraries is a concern. It is a concern how, in another case that I have been privy to, they took a passenger with disabilities to the Federal Court of Appeal in an attempt to overturn the Canadian Transportation Agency's decision. So they are being very combative in the case that I have seen when it comes to rights of passengers with disabilities.
Turning briefly to Ms. Simon from CATSA, you mentioned the fact that disabilities present differently and many of them are invisible. I'm thinking about my own experience as an air traveler and going through security screening at airports. No one's ever asked me if I have a disability or require any special accommodations. Do you? How does CATSA? How do CATSA's contractors identify a need for certain accommodations for people with disabilities when they present themselves at security screening? When I go to security screening, it seems like these days, like it's kind of a yelling based system. I have people barking at me to pull out my liquids and, put my laptop, and, there's a lot of chaos and yelling in some airports at some times. No one has ever stopped and asked if there are special accommodations that are needed. What is the procedure for that?
Well, if somebody comes and presents themselves and says, I need some help, by all means, there's also a family special needs line that they can actually access specifically. I'm actually really happy to announce that we are basically moving to a new contract with all of our contractors. In that new contract, we're actually creating a new, what we call a facilitator role, but it will be somebody that their sole job is to provide bilingual service that will just help facilitate all passengers, but primarily persons with disabilities.
So if I may just jump in.
This is a new job that will not be a screener, just do that. Sorry, go ahead.
So currently the onus is on passengers to request special accommodations? Perhaps we could just get a quick answer, Mr. Chair. Okay.
In the next round, only because you've already gone over, sir. Otherwise, I would have given you that time.
You're always very generous, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And I do want to confirm, Mr. Bachrach, that we've already reached out to Mr. Lepofsky to ensure that he will reappear before committee or appear before committee at another date that works for him. So just wanted to confirm that with you. We'll begin the second round of questioning with Mr. Muse. Mr. Muse, you have 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Dr. Lukács, you were here, of course, a little over a year ago when we had that disastrous travel season. And you talked then, as you're talking today, about inadequate enforcement being one part of the problem. And so I'm curious, because you spoke in your opening remarks about, when the media lens is there, we see different reaction than when it's not. And I would submit that a year ago we were having a discussion about backlogs at CTA. Today they're far worse than they were back then. So as the media lens looked elsewhere, that problem ballooned. So I guess what are the tools? So I mean, maybe make a comment on that parallel, but also what are the tools that are available now that just aren't being adequately enforced?
Unfortunately, when we're talking about air passenger rights, the government has been sabotaging its own policy. Parliament last summer passed legislation that allows increasing the maximum amount of fines, administrative monetary penalties, to $250,000 as the cap per incident per violation of the APPR. Yet the government has not amended the regulations to reflect the same. So in the same vein, Parliament mandated a cost recovery fee to cover taxpayers' expenses for adjudicating complaints that the airlines themselves cause. The consultation hasn't been taken place about that, and the government has not put in place what Parliament expressly mandated.
Thank you. So there's just a lack of will in enforcing then, not necessarily the lack of the tools.
There is significant lack of will. In terms of how much resources are needed for enforcement, that's also a question. The rules need to be simplified and more clear to make the enforcement easier. The fewer data points you need to have a guilty verdict, so to speak, on a violation, the faster an enforcement action can take, and the less effort it takes to defend that enforcement action if the airline challenges it in court.
I'm curious, since you raised the issue about the one person, one fare, or one fare, one person discussion with domestic versus international. What percentage of the instances, or what range, from your opinion, are international versus domestic? I mean, what that we're aware of?
Unfortunately, we don't have statistics on this. That's part and parcel of the problem. It's a whole larger set of problems. It's not just about disability-related issues, although here it is particularly prominent. But if you look at the U.S. DOT's statistics, it's a treasure trove of statistics, and it makes every mathematician and statistician salivate looking at how much data you have and how much research you can do on that. We don't have anything like that in Canada, and while Stats Canada does have some data, they are not allowed to release that data because of legal restrictions.
Thank you. Let me segue from that to questions of our friends from CATSA that are here. Because I guess if I was cynical, I would say, there's a new quarterly report on complaints. Okay, is that a reaction to the stories that we've seen, or is that an ongoing commitment? And to the point about lack of statistics, or at least lack of visibility of statistics, if there is going to be a quarterly report, I mean, what is the annual number of incidences? How many of those were resolved by the airlines? How many of those, by CATSA in your instance? How many of those had to go to the CTA and be elevated? What's the stats on that?
I mean, I can start. Our quarterly report is to look at trends actually internally to see if there's anything. We react on every single complaint as we get it. For example, last year we had 51.5, or the last 3 quarters, I should say, we had 51.5 million passengers that came through our checkpoints. We received 56 accessibility complaints. That represents 0.0001% of accessibility. Don't get me wrong. Every complaint is important. Actually, rather than go into the details, I'll have my director who's responsible for complaints talk a little bit more in terms of the process, but we call them immediately. And Rhoda, I don't know if you want to add more.
We had 56 complaints, as Nada mentioned. And we had, I believe, 1 that came in through the CTA.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muse. Next up, we have Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to all of our witnesses today. What we are talking about today, of course, is a real concern for all of us as MPs, as we hear from some of our constituents, of course, about the challenges of flying, particularly those with disabilities. When you fly, there seems to be very little accommodation in a lot of cases, and unlike what you find if you're flying, for example, taking a train like via, there's accommodations for people with disabilities and wheelchairs. We don't see that in many of the airlines. I want to talk about the Auditor General report, and there were 3 areas that were outlined for improvement. Specifically, the report highlighted 3 areas for improvement for CATSA. One was to meet the web accessibility standards. The second is the timelines of accessibility training and further consultations with persons with disabilities related to that training. And the final one is to develop and implement a strategy to better analyze complaint data. So can you share as a group with this committee if there's been any improvements in one or all of these areas that were identified?
Thank you so much for the question. Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to actually report that there's been progress in all 3 of those areas. As mentioned, in terms of the first one, well, I'll talk to the web accessibility. The system that actually that we needed for it has been updated. It's fully functional. We've been moving all of our forms, everything, to make them fully accessible. The plan is by this March, so in a month from now, that by the end of the month, everything is fully accessible. We've put up already the really important things like what you can bring, liquids, wait times, those things that passengers need. Those are fully accessible now. What we're still working on, which becomes a little bit more difficult, are things like our corporate plans, because there's so much in there to make them accessible. So that is what we're working on now. In terms of training, what the Auditor General said, there was a couple of things. One was making sure that we can actually train fast as soon as people come, not only decision makers, but all screening officers. The screening officers, when I came in, I guess last April, to a previous committee as well, we had 100%, and we still have 100% of screening officers fully trained. At this point in time, you're not allowed on the floor until you've had your full training on accessibility. Then, for all of the decision makers in management, as soon as you're hired, you're basically given a very short time frame to do all of your accessibility training. There's also refresher courses every year. We now also have, our system can monitor and measure to make sure if you didn't do it, I can tell, and we send you an email and say, you have to do it. So happy to say that I can tell you, everybody, right now I have 100% of decision makers, managers, and screening officers fully trained. In terms of the training also, one of the advice from the Auditor General was that we work with persons with disabilities on the training. We've actually done quite a bit of work on that. Some of the training that we've done, new training, as well as screening passengers with vision loss, screening passengers with reduced mobility, and accessibility awareness, where we had all kinds of people with different types of disabilities come in and talk about their lived experience. And those are part of the training. So they actually say, this is what I experienced, this is how you can improve it. So that's helped us quite a bit, not only improve, but also teach people what they need to do from their own perspective, which has been very helpful. In terms of complaint data, we've actually done all the work now in terms of assessing how we can manage it better. We're working with our systems to see what's in the realm of the possible and working internally to make sure it works for everybody. Our next step is to work with persons with disability to make sure if we report on it, does it make sense to them? And then after that, we'll be implementing it. The target date is September 2024, and we're on target for that as well. Thank you for the question.
So it's great to hear that CATSA has done all this work and moving forward on recommendations from the Auditor General's report and so on. But when you fly to, as Mr. Straw said, to small regional airports, and I refer to places like Gander, for example, For me, for the past year and a half, 2 years, flying to the East Coast, it's a nightmare. It's like most days it's leave here at 5:30 in the morning and get into Ganner late on Friday. It's gotten to the point where I spend more weekends in Ottawa rather than spend the entire weekend in an aircraft or an airport. But when I see some of these aircraft, I wonder, how are we treating people with disabilities? Because there are no accommodations for people in wheelchairs. There are no accommodations for anybody to be able to bring their wheelchair or to onboard the aircraft and so on. I wonder, why is it that, all these things that we're doing, we haven't really focused on modernizing and retrofitting aircraft to provide more comfortable accommodations for people with major disabilities.
A very short answer, please.
I can't speak to the aircraft, but actually what we are trying to do, we're working with all of our suppliers in terms of, for example, we're trying to get walk-through full body scanners. They don't exist in the industry right now where they can be certified by the TSA or ECAC, but once we can get those will be on our plans. As soon as we can get anybody to certify that they will do their job, that's a priority for us.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Rogers. Prochainement, nous avons M. Barclay-Duval. 2 minutes et demie, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais revenir à Monsieur Lukács et je vais commencer en citant des exemples vus dans les médias. Radio-Canada, 9 novembre 2023, sur un vol de WestJet. Ici, je parle du cas, par exemple, de... Excusez-moi, il faut que je retrouve le nom. Madame Gilliard affirme qu'ils ont quasiment laissé tomber son conjoint en tentant de le transférer. Donc, prochain exemple que j'ai, c'est avec une compagnie aérienne différente. On est avec Air Transat. On parle du reporté à Radio-Canada le 2 août 2022. Le personnel de la compagnie aérienne l'a laissé tomber dans l'allée lors de son transfert vers son siège. Et un petit peu plus loin, si je parle cette fois-ci qu'une troisième compagnie aérienne, il s'agit d'Air Canada, publié le 5 février 2004 dans la presse.
Monsieur Barclay-Duval, excuse-moi, je veux juste confirmer que la traduction fonctionne. Non, je vois M. Backrack qui dit non, M. Barouet dit non. Donc, ça ne marche pas. On va juste arrêter. Je vais vous redonner votre 2 minutes et demie, M. Barclay-Duval.
This is the interpreter. It should be working now. If you can hear me, this is the interpreter. It should be working now. Okay, so it's working for everyone. Fine. My apologies, Mr. Barclay-Duval. Please start again. Thank you, Chair. So you cited 3 examples. I'll start again. The first example, published in Radio-Canada, November 2023, on the WestJet flight. It refers to lines, and Lisa talked to her husband, and the personnel virtually dropped almost dropped her husband transporting the seat. And a year earlier, in 2022, August, Radio-Canada, an Air Transat flight here refers to staff who, in the alley, they dropped an individual, reduced mobility traveler, and it took more than 3 minutes to raise this gentleman and place him in his seat. February 5, 2024, another article that was published on La Presse newspaper. Here, once again, Air Canada, it refers to a man who was dropped and injured when the Air Canada staff did not use the elevator as requested. So it seems to be very similar situations that keep occurring, and the staff are not trained, it seems, to take care of those people, or the equipment is inadequate in the airplanes. So, Mr. Lukács, I'd like to know what you think about that, and what is the reason for it. Isn't there some duty or obligation for the staff to be properly trained to take care of people of reduced mobility?
Thank you for the question. There is clearly a duty for the airline to properly train staff and to ensure that its staff have the necessary tools to provide accessibility in transportation. In my view, that duty also extends to any subcontractor that the airline hires as agents or in any other capacity to do work for the boarding and disembarking of passengers on that flight. Part of the problem is perhaps a cultural issue that there may be a culture of cutting corners, of let's not do things by the book. what needs to be instilled is that these things do matter, and that is why significant fines would be important to get this point across, that this is no joke. This is a serious matter.
Merci beaucoup, Mr. Barcelval.
Thank you, Mr. Barceau-Duval.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to try to fit in two questions, one to Ms. Saman and one to Mr. Lukacs. To Ms. Saman, can I understand from your previous response that CATSA is in the process of moving from a system whereby passengers are required to identify their disabilities and required accommodations to one in which CATSA will proactively ask passengers if there is special accommodation that they need? I can see you shaking your head, so I look forward to the clarification.
Okay. No, actually, we will not ask, because from a privacy perspective, we would never come up and say, do you have any disability or require assistance? But our screening contractors are trained to observe proactively if somebody may need assistance. They also are trained to look for the sunflower, the lanyard, for people with hidden disabilities who want the extra help. What we will be doing, which is new coming up, is we're going to have non-screening officers, people who are fluently bilingual, that their sole job is to help people through the system, so to help people through the security screening. So if they see somebody struggling, they'll literally walk them through to the special needs line or to any line to make sure that they're there with them throughout the process, provide them any support they need. Those are additional resources that we never had in any previous contract, but they are just for the support of the traveling public, and specifically for persons that require additional assistance.
Thank you for the response. I'll just look to the chair whether I have any seconds to ask Mr. Lukacs a question.
You have 58 seconds, Mr. Beck.
58, I can do it. Dr. Lukacs, turning to the accessibility of the onboard experience, so passengers getting on the airplane and taking their seat, does the fact that flight attendants, who are really responsible for assisting with that process, flight attendants aren't actually paid until the airplane takes off, does that fact impact their ability to assist and ensure that people with disabilities are accommodated?
Personally, I'm finding it very troubling that crew members don't get paid for the work that they do, and that work doesn't start when the flight takes off. So I obviously support fair payment paid to the crew members. In terms of these disability issues, I'm not sure if it directly relates to it, because the physical force that's required to assist the person into their seat may not be in the position of those flight attendants who just are trained to push a trolley and not to perhaps lift.
Thank you.
Person. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lukacs, and thank you, Mr. Bachrach. We'll have a bit of a lightning round here for the next two on the docket. Mr. Strahl, I'll give you 3.5 minutes, please.
Okay, I'll go straight to Ms. Simon. You mentioned that you wouldn't ask about disability or accessibility questions. However, whenever you check in for a flight with a Canadian airline, you put into your when you check in, it asks if you have an accessibility request. Does that information appear because CATSA scans both when I enter the lineup and when I start to put my bags on the belt? Would that information appear to the CATSA screener? And if not, do you think that is something that's possible, or is there something preventing that information from being shared?
We don't get it now. It's actually a good point. I'm not sure from a privacy perspective we could, but there's nothing stopping us from asking the questions and seeing if that's possible.
Because you get my name, you get the flight I'm taking, all of that. So that perhaps is something that we can ask the airlines as well, if they're willing to share that data throughout the airline experience. Mr. Lukacs, you mentioned a $100,000 fine should be imposed if a wheelchair or a mobility aid is left behind. What are you basing that number on, other than it's round and has several figures in it? Are there other examples in a non-travel experience where other entities, I don't know, hotels or that sort of thing that fail to provide this have been issued those types of penalties? Or is this, I guess that's my question, how we can talk about large fines, which perhaps would have an impact on behavior. But I'm just wondering, are there examples of where that, where are you drawing that number from? And are there comparables in other countries or in other sectors of the Canadian economy where that might that number might have come from?
There are two sources for these numbers, maybe even three. The first one is looking at the maximum fines available for disability-related violations under the current legislation, which is pegged at $250,000. So it is not going all the full $250,000 per offense, but it is still significant. The other source is looking at the airline's revenue. If the fine is too small, it is just the cost of doing business. The third aspect, which of course you can do far more precise analysis, is what I would colloquially call the Kaplow formula. It is based on textbook on analysis and law, where you use probabilistic methods to gauge what kind of fine is necessary to dissuade a particular conduct, bearing in mind the potential financial gain from that conduct, financial gain from preventing that conduct, how much it will cost the airline to take steps to avoid that particular conduct, and how often that issue gets detected.
Thank you.
So there's a science to it.
Thank you, Mr. Luchach. And finally, for the first hour today, we have Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. You have 3.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do want to preface my comments by saying this, that we are attempting today to be proactive and hopefully not get to the space that we have to react. When it comes to fines, yes, we expect regulation, procedures, and standards to be put in place. But at the end of the day, we have to focus on these things not happening in the first place. And of course, with that, enforcement has to be a part of that. And then, of course, a separate discussion is reactive when it comes to fines, etc. But I'll say this, and it sort of disturbs me that we don't have an end-to-end process. This is a service. Bottom line, it's a service. And we have to recognize that mobility aids are not luggage. They are, in fact, an extension of one's body and independence, period. So with that said, it's incumbent upon all of us as government, to ensure that we continue to analyze and improve business practices across the board. That's our job. But we can only do that with our partners, and that's you. So the end-to-end service, airport, CATSA, and the airlines is incumbent. And with that, the goal is to extend or provide a positive customer experience end to end. So my question to you, and I'm going to be asking the same question to those folks back there who don't look very happy, is this: why aren't you, CATSA, as well as the airport and the airlines, working together to in fact come with recommendations, standards, procedures, therefore on our part regulations, to provide that end-to-end experience?
Quite honestly, I couldn't agree that we need to do that more. We've actually, it's funny, we had the meeting when I first started on board, and we met with WestJet, and that is something we feel we need to do. We need to look at the entire experience, because it's not, I cannot improve the service just by looking at what CATSA can do. We need to look at it holistically and for all passengers and non-passengers. And we have been working quite closely with airport by airport, because also every airport is different, right? And depending on what they have and what they don't have, we can improve the service. So it's not, we don't have a standard system across every single airport. So we are working now airport by airport, and we'd be more than happy to work together to create one holistic view of the passenger experience that we could improve completely there. That was actually what I mentioned also to the accessibility, the chief accessibility officer, that we would love to be part of that.
May I suggest this? Because I think that's the goal that we all want to achieve with this study. We have analysts here that are going to be taking a lot of notes, and therefore a lot of recommendations from those notes. And then, of course, we're going to expect a response back from the minister. And with that, the expectation is that we are all in this together. So may I suggest this? We have, I believe, WestJet back there in the corner. Unfortunately, you didn't get here at the beginning, which would have been nice, so you can hear this. And with that said, possibly when they come up with the second part of the meeting, you can stick around to hear what's going to be said and discussed with them. And I think that has to continue. And it's too bad Air Canada wasn't here from day one. But then therefore, as we progress through this study, that we actually understand, hear, learn what each other are challenged with. And then with that said, come out with a solution together, all providers, from that person's experience the second they walk into that airport, to getting into the CATSA line, to getting onto the airplane, from getting off the airplane, through the airport again, until they get into that vehicle that's going to take them to their end destination. It's an experience, and we have to make that a positive experience. So may I suggest this? We all work on this together throughout this entire study. So let's all pay attention to what each other are doing, how we're going to react, how the strategies we're going to put in place, and therefore the procedures, regulations, and standards are harmonized between all the providers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Mr. Badaway. And on behalf of all members, I want to thank our witnesses for joining us here in person and, of course, by video conference. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. We'll now suspend the meeting until such time as we can welcome the witnesses for our second hour. This meeting stands suspended. Colleagues, appearing for the second hour today, we have from WestJet Airlines, Mr. Alexis von Hoensbroek, Chief Executive Officer. Welcome to you. We have Mr. Andrew Gibbons, Vice President, External Affairs. Welcome back, Mr. Gibbons. And we have Mr. Todd Peterson, Director, Regulatory Affairs. Thank all three of you for appearing before committee today. I'll turn it over to you to get us started with your opening remarks. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning. Mr. Chair and honorable committee members. My name is Alexis von Hoensbroek, and congratulations for pronouncing it in the right way. Rarely happens. And I'm the CEO of the WestJet Group. I'm today joined with two of my colleagues. You already introduced them, Andy Gibbons, VP for External Affairs, and Todd Peterson, Director of Regulatory Affairs, and he's also heading our task force for accessibility issues. Thank you for having us here today on a topic that is deeply important to me. To WestJet, to WestJet's entire team, and to all our guests. I appreciate the opportunity to be here in person today to contribute to your study on accessible transportation. Of the 8 million Canadians who identify as having a disability, 72% reported encountering some accessibility barriers over the past year. We want to be part of improving the statistics. I would like to speak directly to our guests and to our Canadians who are listening today. Thank you for choosing or considering WestJet, and I assure you that we are committed to making transportation more accessible for travelers with disability. J'aimerais m'adresser directement à nos invités.
I would like to directly address all our guests and all Canadians. Thank you for considering or having chosen WestJet for your travel. And I assure you that we are committed to making transportation more accessible for our guests with disabilities.
Every WestJetter understands the importance of meeting our guests' accessibility needs. In 2023, over 260,000 WestJet reservations included a request for a special service related to disability. Wheelchair-related services accounted for most of those at 230,000. This means on average over 700 guests every day need accessibility support as they travel with us. Over 99.9% of those guests had a good experience. While perfection is hard to achieve, it is what we must strive for in meeting the needs of our guests with disabilities. We also recognize that when things can and do go wrong, we must be at the top of our game to make things right as quickly and seamlessly as possible. Our guests who didn't have a good travel experience with us, we are sincerely sorry and we are committed in doing better. À nos invités qui n'ont pas une bonne expérience.
So to our guests who did not have a positive experience, we are sincerely sorry and we commit to doing better.
That must work together to serve travelers. Airports, airlines, third-party handlers, ground equipment manufacturers, and aircraft manufacturers, to name a few, must all take on the challenge together. At WestJet, we are doing our part through investments to make air travel more accessible. We provide initial and ongoing accessibility training to all guest-facing staff. We employ medical experts to ensure we understand and assess the travel needs of guests with disabilities. We are an active participant in industry forums where best practices are being shared and advanced. And we ensure our approaches are informed through engagement with international and external parties with expertise or lived experience. All that said, we know there's more to do to remove barriers for travel, for people with disabilities. We are actively seeking opportunities to provide accessible services for both our guests and our employees, and we are committed to learning and growing in this space. WestJet has a robust accessibility plan, and I've appointed Todd to lead the internal task force that constantly reviews and implements improvements. WestJet is committed to continuous improvement and is here to be part of the solution. We can assure parliamentarians and our valued guests that accessibility is and will remain a top priority for WestJet. I'm pleased to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks. We'll begin our line of questioning today with Mr. Strahl. Mr. Strahl, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the WestJet team for being here today. I want, I appreciate your remarks. I read different press releases through the National Airlines Council and from your own website and everything. Everyone's always very sorry and very committed to doing better whenever these things happen, but these high-profile incidents continue to plague Canadian Airlines, including yours with, stories of, a Paralympian being forced to make her way up the stairs using her own strength. I know there was some service offered, but it wasn't acceptable to her. We keep hearing stories about mobility aids, wheelchairs being left behind when these are critical. They're specialized pieces of equipment. They can't simply be replaced by a rental at the other end. So I guess we need to see where the rubber's going to hit the road here. And, thoughts and prayers are no longer acceptable. So I guess I'm looking for, I'll stick with the mobility aids to get down to the brass tacks of it here. What are you doing to ensure that it is impossible for someone with a mobility aid to arrive at their destination without it and without it being damaged? What specific steps is WestJet taking to ensure that that kind of situation simply is impossible when it comes to someone taking a WestJet flight?
Mark, for the question. And first, let me say that whenever these cases that you refer to happen, this is as bad for us as it is for those people that are exposed to this. So we sincerely apologize to them. But we equally always look at our internal processes and try to understand what went wrong, because we are an organization that wants to deliver a good service. And this works in the vast majority of the cases, but every case that goes wrong is one too many. We know that, and we use this always as an opportunity to improve. So out of 1,000 mobility aids that we transport, 999 will make it safely and undamaged to the destination. That's good. And that's, by the way, that's better than we perform on normal bags, which already shows that we put much more attention on this. However, the one is also one too many. So we are currently working through what can we do to improve this. And there are a couple of things that we can do. We are about to introduce a process where we get a positive confirmation that we can deliver to the guest that the mobility aid is actually on board. So that's a process that we're going to introduce very soon. We also will make sure that every single mobility aid is properly wrapped. So we do this on part of our network, but we will roll this out to the entire network, because we have seen cases where a wheel was bent after transportation, and this created problems. That's certainly a problem. And we also know that we need to be clearer within our own regulations, but also towards our guests around size and weight of the mobility aids, because some of them are actually pretty big and create quite a challenge to take them on board.
I appreciate that. I want to ask one more question. Sure. It's about when someone books a ticket on WestJet and they've identified that they have an accessibility or disability need. At what point does WestJet take ownership of that passenger in terms of the care for the passenger? And at what point Vance asked about end-to-end care, because we've heard of stories where There's a rebooking. People are waiting. You're now waiting for a flight for 4 hours, and they're just sitting in the gate area. What is the relationship that you have with the airports to ensure that there's not a missed handoff where people are not provided care and customer service from the time they enter the airport until the time they exit your aircraft at the other end? How do you work with the airports to ensure that that's happening?
So first of all, we know that we own the guest relationship, so we are at the end always accountable for making sure that they make it through the airport into their seat and the way out again. However, we also can only re-emphasize what has been said before by Manada and others. It is an end-to-end experience that we need to get right, and this involves various stakeholders. And I'm not saying this because I would be finger-pointing at anyone, but we have to work together to get a seamless experience. And I think there's room for improvement in Canada. I've worked in Europe before, if you allow me to just add this experience. I've worked in Europe before, and in Europe there was a regulation introduced about 15 years ago that was actually targeting this end-to-end piece by saying that all services related to passengers with reduced mobilities must be provided by the airport and only by the airport, end to end. And this took a lot of complexity out of the systems, no more handover points, no different parties handling wheelchairs and doing all the logistics around it. And this has dramatically improved the end-to-end airport experience at the European airports.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Thank you, Mr. von Hoensbroek. Next, we will go to Ms. Koutrakis. Ms. Koutrakis, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our guests from WestJet for appearing before Transport Committee once again to discuss this very, very important issue. And unfortunately, we have all seen news items out there where quite a few of our fellow Canadians with disabilities do not feel that they have the same traveling experience as many of us without disabilities currently enjoy. With that said, I heard that, according to the statistics that you shared, 700 passengers a day with disabilities are being serviced by WestJet. And so I want to give you the opportunity, and I believe you when you say that you want to do better. So having said that, and everything to do better stems from money. So I'm just wondering if you could share with us today, how much did WestJet make in the last quarter, and how much of that is going to be invested to make sure that, passengers with disabilities are going to have a better experience?
Thank you. So WestJet has always invested into delivering a superior guest experience, and I think we also have a reputation and a track record of doing so. And we measure our guest experience very, very thoroughly and with data. And maybe an interesting fact to share with you, we measure both the passenger experience of our guests without disabilities and those with disabilities. And interestingly, and consistently over many, many years, we saw that the way that passengers with disabilities rate our service is significantly better than average passengers would rate our service. And this is rightfully so, and has to be so, because every passenger with disability deserves special attention, and they get special attention. So this is a very, very consistent theme. So on the large scale of things, I don't think we have a cultural problem or we have an attention problem. Having said that, we are an organization made out of humans, and sometimes errors happen, and we know that's in every organization, and we take every error that's happening and every mistake that's happening, every terrible story that's happening as an opportunity to improve our service.
I'm just wondering, the first part of my question was if you could share with us, please, how much were the revenues that, my question is, and I'm sure if it's online, we can find it there, but I think for the record, it would be interesting for us to hear the amount that WestJet made in the last quarter.
So we are a private company. We don't disclose financials, but we have said that we have been profitable every single quarter last year, and that's good because this gives us the means to do necessary investments into services. At the end of the day, we need to be an organization that delivers good service to our guests and good service to all of our guests, and this is what we will always invest money in.
Mr. Van Bernsburg, are you committed to looking into acquiring technology and aircraft that would be more accessibility friendly and that can be accommodated? Wheelchairs, for instance. We've heard, and seen stories that, many of the passengers that are currently traveling with wheelchairs have a very difficult time. Are you willing to say to us here today that you're willing to take some of those profits and make sure that you purchase technology and aircraft that would be more accessible to passengers traveling with wheelchairs?
But we will always ensure that we have solutions that work for our guests. And again, it really depends on what kind of mobility aids they have. So there are some very complex and heavy and sizable mobility aids in some cases. And we have a fleet of very different type of airplanes. So we have big airplanes like the Intercontinental 787s that have actually quite some room also on the passenger level for mobility aids. And then we also have relatively small regional turboprop airplanes that actually have no space at all in the passenger cabin, but they have a space in the hold to transport this. And whatever it takes to make it possible, we will always do. Part of it is technology or can be technology related, but a lot of it is also process related. So the example I made before, that we have a positive confirmation that the airplane will not take off unless the passenger gets a positive confirmation that the wheelchair has been loaded. Mm-hmm. That's probably the most meaningful thing that we can do to ensure that the wheelchair arrives with the guest at the destination.
I wanted to switch into training. You said in your testimony that all employees receive training. Is this training mandatory for all employees? How many of your employees have completed the training? And more importantly, has the executive team and maybe board members of WestJet also received this training? Have you ever received this training?
So the way we do it is that every employee that has that is guest facing, that potentially interacts with people with disabilities, has to be trained, and every employee or supplier that is handling equipment has to be trained. So, and they have, it's mandatory, it's repetitive, so it's constantly being updated. What we don't have is it's not that every leader and every executive, no matter what the role is, has to do every training in the company. So I, for example, don't take flight training because I'm not a pilot, but I make sure that every pilot is properly trained. So my job is to make sure that everyone who interacts with people with disabilities or with their equipment is properly trained, and that's the case. Of course, we have awareness training, and this is what we all go through.
Thank you, Ms. Koutrakis. Next, prochainement, nous avons M. Barcelou-Duval. À vous la parole, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à nos...
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the witnesses from WestJet. Thank you to our WestJet. I would like to go back to the training of staff. I look at some cases where people who have had problems with reduced mobility. You note quickly that most cases there was a lack of training. The staff did not know how to deal with it. In this case, for instance, Ms. Filia, it was another situation. These were people who were not properly trained because they did not know how to deal with these people. So the question I have for you, because you said that every member of staff had to follow training. So how come these situations occur if the staff was properly trained?
Improve this training curriculum to make sure that the training always improves, and we also capture those cases where we saw things going wrong. So generally, I'm actually pretty confident that the training level of our staff is good. However, I also recognize that in some cases we are maybe not as clear as we should be how to handle some special devices. So we had cases where there's a big mobility aid that didn't fit into the cargo hold. So the people would try to make it work in best intentions. So they tilt it over to the side, and the tilting it over to the side would then cause either a damage or some unintended functioning of the of the device. And with this, doing something in good intention to actually get it on board and let it fly with the guests, but as part of the good intention, actually damaging a device. So these are things that we saw happening, and we draw our conclusions. So going forward, we will be much clearer in what kind of devices and what sizes and weight we actually can fly on a particular aircraft type, and which ones we also can't. And I think that this is one of the improvements that we need to do. But I'm confident that overall the training program is effective, and we absolutely ensure that everyone performs those trainings.
Donc, ce que vous me dites, c'est que de votre perspective, l'entraînement et la formation est adéquat, mais il
You
reste...
tell me that all this is adequate, but there are situations which keep occurring. I am not fully satisfied by this reply. It's not only WestJet, we've seen it on Air Transat, on Air Canada, and this is something which is regular. And there's another thing which is also regular, is the question how the complaints are dealt with by the airlines. There is a difference when people have to go to the media. In the same case that I spoke to you, I was told that when they complained, they've never heard from WestJet, only when it was in the media, and then the press calls the airlines. Are these cases treated differently than the ones which are not in the media?
First of all, this is why I'm here, because I also need to interact and hear from you what you're hearing. However, some cases make it to the media, some cases don't make it to the media, but every case is being brought to our attention, and every single case is a case that we investigate in order to improve our service, because it is our ambition to provide a good service. These guests are as valuable as any other guests to us, and we want to be an accessible airline, and that has been our ambition from the first day. That doesn't mean that we are perfect. No organization is ever perfect, and there's no organization where never any mistakes or errors are happening. But we have a good track record as even as an industry to learning from mistakes. If you just look at flight safety, for instance, I mean,
J'aurais peut-être une dernière question à vous poser avant que j'ai plus de temps. L'Office des transports du Canada mentionne avoir reçu...
It was mentioned that how many complaints have been received with people who have reduced mobility. How many of these thousands complaints came to WestJet?
So last year we had 260,000 wheelchair-related guests, and we had about 200 complaints. Am I correct?
200 complaints, and approximately 200 complaints that we received and investigated, and some of those also involved damage or various events with mobility devices, and we fixed or repaired about 390 mobility devices. So quite small numbers relative to the very large amount of passengers with accessibility that we carry.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Parcival. Next, prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Backrack.
Mr. Backrack, you have the floor. 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the team from WestJet for joining our committee meeting. I'm just looking through some of these high-profile stories from last year alone involving the mistreatment of passengers with disabilities. The situation involving Melanie Carlbeck's wheelchair, which was left behind on her flight. She was given a wheelchair that wasn't suitable, and her own chair didn't arrive until days later. Also in 2023, Phil Gilliard was dropped by WestJet staff that did not know how to use an Eagle lift. This resulted in a bloody wound and bad bruises on his arm. 4-year-old Blake Turnbull went without a wheelchair for over a month after WestJet damaged the rim of her wheelchair, making the brakes unusable. And the staff allowed Blake to pull herself off the plane by wriggling along the floor and proceeded to call her a salamander. And then finally, and we heard this cited earlier in questioning, former Paralympian Sarah Morris Probert had to lift herself up the stairs of the aircraft because the only other option WestJet gave her to board her plane was to be carried up the stairs in a wheelchair, which I don't believe is a safe practice. I'm just wondering, and perhaps your answer to the last question provided some indication of this, but what percentage, these are only the cases that received media attention, what percentage of the overall number of cases of passenger mistreatment do the cases I just read represent?
Thank you for that question. And every single case that you describe is a terrible case, and this is always a case where we thoroughly investigate and try to understand what led up to the events that were eventually reported in the media. So it's always a learning opportunity for us. But as I also said, it's about 200 complaints over 250,000 guests that we fly with disabilities. So the percentage is low. It's very, very low. It's 99.9% of the guests actually have a good experience. Having said that, every single case is a case too many. So definitely for us an option to work or a mandatory thing to work on. However, it's also important, and we all know that media is sometimes also showing one angle to the story, and for us, it's always important to understand what was actually happening. So we have a medical team that has the dedicated job to talk to those individuals and understand what was going on, see how we can support and help them, but especially understand what went wrong on the particular case. And let me just pick on one. So the example of the Paralympic woman that crawled up the stairs in Los Cabos in Mexico. So in this case, we have a contract with the airport that we always get the aircraft to a finger position so that they can actually horizontally enter the airplane, and that's the standard. And on this particular day, for airport congestion, our airplane was actually forced to park on the tarmac, which is unusual and not how it should be. But it again shows that this is an ecosystem that has to work together, and the seamless experience will always require everyone to perform, and not just the airline. So we were on the tarmac, and we informed that lady that we have a challenge now to get her on board. There is, of course, always a plan B, how to get someone on board in such a situation where just stairs are available, and there's a trained and approved and safe process to do this, which is carrying up that guest up the stairs, because that's the only option left. But there's an approved process how to do it. Now, I understand this is not a great process, so I don't like that either. But it was the next best option, or the last good option that we had. And then this particular lady decided that she doesn't want it, and she preferred to push herself up the stairs. Now, of course, this is a humiliating experience, and I can't imagine how bad this was for her. But it was also her particular choice to do this. Now, I'm asking many questions around this as well now. So why does Los Cabos not have a proper device to lift someone up? How is the rest of our system composed of airports? Because we fly to lots and lots of airports, and many of them are not in Canada, but they are in Mexico and the Caribbean. They're all over the place, and the airport infrastructure is often quite diverse. So these are the questions that we ask, but we certainly never offered a unsafe procedure to that lady.
I think
I appreciate
Mr. Bacharach. Just to add to that is, after that incident, Todd and I reached out to that guest personally, had a conversation with her, and then we actually scheduled a discussion with the Chief Accessibility Officer of Canada. And through those conversations, that's how we're learning. That's how we're getting more information. We're not sitting around feeling sorry for ourselves watching these clips on the media. We're taking action. We're meeting with the guests. We're meeting with the Chief Accessibility Officer. And as we've said, this is a continuous improvement, a continuous learning.
No, I appreciate that. I guess what I would add is that when the committee hears things like the number of accessibility complaints is a very small fraction of the total number of people with disabilities that are transported. It sounds like I'll just say it. It sounds like minimizing the problem. We're trying to rationalize it when, I think what we want is proactive action. But I want to ask a question. I know my time is running out.
But sorry,
I want to.
I just want to clarify. I know it's a small number, and we are proud it's a small number because it shows that our organization is taking this very serious. But nevertheless, I also said every single case is one case too many. And every single case is a case that we have to fix.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Backrack. We'll go to our second round now, and we'll begin with Mr. Muse. Mr. Muse, you have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses from WestJet. We've had some discussion, and I know that you've talked about the fact that your procedures are being updated, and there's obviously training around that training that has been in place for some time that has been asked about already. But I want to ask about not just the training, but maybe the training that is done in terms of awareness and sensitivity, just because we're hearing some examples where staff walked by people who were having instances. So has that changed given the media stories, some of which were highlighted here? And how is that going to continue to change to make sure that it's one thing to phone passengers and have that conversation after, but what's concrete actions taking place to make sure that there's a high level of sensitivity around these incidences?
So first of all, we don't care about accessibility because of media, but because it's a genuine part of our business to be an accessible airline, and that's why we constantly improve. But maybe I can hand over to Todd to speak to some of the actual actions that he, as the leader of our task force, is now taking.
Yeah, certainly to your point, when we do accessibility training, a large element of the training is role specific, of course. What you'll train an airport agent to do versus a person who works in the cabin to do would be clearly job specific. But one thing that's common across all of our training is what we call the sensitivity element of training. So we have a very strong portion of the curriculum that does focus on respectful interaction, how to identify and work with guests to understand their actual needs, and then apply our processes and procedures in a way that meets their needs. So that is very consistent and uniform across our training programs.
I want to ask about international airports, because we heard in the last panel, and we all know that there are certainly standards around Canadian airports. WestJet obviously flies to many sun destinations, and you just mentioned that one particular incident in Los Cabos. So what is your responsibility as an airline in working with or understanding the fact that maybe the standards are different and the equipment is different and the procedures are different at international airports to mitigate that proactively, and address that up front?
Yeah, so it's of course our job to ensure that we have consistent service across our entire network, not just the Canadian network. Having said that, we also have to work with the infrastructure and the way the airports are being equipped that we fly to. And not every airport is the same. By the way, also not in Canada. So if you go to some remote airports in northern Canada, it can also look pretty different than when you fly to Toronto or Calgary. So therefore, whenever we are at an airport that doesn't have the same type of infrastructure, then we develop workaround processes that are safe and deliver the right outcome. Although we recognize that sometimes they are not great, like in this example with the Paralympic athlete.
We asked the last panel about the number of instances internationally versus domestically, and there isn't a good record keeping or stats on that. So I don't know if you could add some context in terms of what you're seeing, international versus domestic.
Oh, we would have to get back on that. I actually don't have the breakdown international versus domestic.
I guess you track that.
Yeah, for sure.
Would you be able to research that and table that with the committee?
Yes, sure, absolutely.
Okay, that's fine. Let me ask as well, because you mentioned in a brief that was sent that there's being and here as well, that a fulsome review of your accessibility plan is being conducted, and you were hoping to have meaningful improvements this year. So when you say this year, can you be more specific in terms of a timeline? What are the key milestones that you would expect to see, that I think we would expect to see, to do this, more expeditiously than just saying this year. I mean, there's 8
Yeah.
months left in the year, 10 months left in the year.
Yeah, for sure. As soon as possible, but let Todd speak to that.
Yeah, there are a number of items which are actively in motion, and on some of the items we're literally more like months away as opposed to this year away. So we'd expect to be rolling out some of these solutions before summer, and we're prioritizing them. Especially the highest focus for us right now is this positive confirmation that the wheelchair boards with the guest. We have an existing process that we're going to apply to that. We have the materials and special tags that we need are already on order, and as soon as they arrive, we'll be rolling that process out across our airports. So that is our highest priority, and the others will follow.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muse, and thank you, Mr. Peterson. Next, we'll go to Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start off by saying I'm not going to repeat myself. With respect to the comments made earlier, you were in the gallery and you heard them, so I'll cut right to it. And concentrating on the establishment of standards. And when I say the establishment of standards, I'm saying end to end. So I'm not just discussing this with you. I'm also discussing this with the folks that were prior to you, and of course the ones that are going to come after you. And of course, with that said, is harmonizing that end to end experience. The second thing I'll say is the fact that it's also imperative that we recognize when we go into this process that the word should doesn't exist, it's will. And secondly, the word no doesn't exist, it's how. And that is essentially the mindset, I guess, we all have to have in terms of reaching the outcomes that are expected by those that are your customers. And in your customers, and of course, the customers of the airport. The next thing I'll say is that, again, I want to emphasize this comment that I made earlier is providing a positive customer experience end to end. And regardless of whether it's one person or it's 1,000 people, it's relevant and it's important and it's a priority. And the last thing I'll say before I go to my question is the fact that it's all about service, 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 service. And with that, upon the outcome of this study and the recommendations that we're going to be providing, as well as the response that we're going to be expecting from the minister, it's still a work in progress to provide that end-to-end strategy. And the expectation, as I said earlier, is that it's not just the airlines, it's not just CATSA, and it's not just the airports providing that strategy, it's end-to-end. Airports, CATSA, airlines, and other, I'll say that. So my question, and it somewhat goes to Mr. Muse's question, but I want to get a bit more to you, Mr. Peterson, granular on where you're at now, is you met with the Minister of Transport and the Minister of Diversity and Inclusion this past December, I believe. And with that, both you and Air Canada have taken to the news, to the media, stating that you will be investing significantly in new equipment at Canadian airports, such as lifts, to ensure that we can meet the expectations of your customers. And again, your customers as an airline, as well as CATSA, and as well as the airports. So can you provide us some details on the size and scope of this initiative, and get granular on exactly what you're doing from the time that you had the meeting with the ministers till now?
Yeah, thank you. As I was saying a moment ago, we have put a lot of effort into solving the large issue of confirming that the wheelchair is aboard with the guest. So that is the first initiative we're going to roll out. The second item we've been working on extensively is surveying our network and understanding the different pieces of equipment that exist across our network. And as Alexis said, there is a variety. But we do need to get much more clear on what is our capability for handling mobility devices, specifically with respect to size and weight. We think through the work we've done so far, in many cases, we'll actually be able to confirm that we're, in many cases, able to handle devices that are larger or heavier than what we handle today. So there'll be an increase in the service. But as Alexis also said, in some cases, we do need to be more clear with our guests about what our limitations are. And in some cases, there will be some reductions. But the good outcome on both ends of that is that our guests will clearly know what to expect from us.
Now, with that said, you are working with the airports, you are working with CATSA to have that harmonization. Once again, standards, procedures, and then secondly is the infrastructure that would be invested in. So with that, are these investments based on airports or the number of accessibility services that you provide per airport?
We're looking network wide, and we are looking for opportunities. And as Alexis was saying, a large driver of our focus is where we've fallen down and had issues in the past. So that is highlighting for us where the gaps are in our processes. We're not too concerned about exactly where they are. We simply want to find the most prevalent gaps and systematically close them so that we do provide that excellent customer service for all of our guests all the time that you referred to.
And are you working with the disability community as well?
Absolutely. We have an internal task force. We have, of course, we're a large company. We have people internally that have lived experience and dealing with the disabilities as part of their lives. We also work with outside organizations such as the Open Door organization to make sure that that the community is heard and involved and understands what we're doing, and we get their perspective to make sure the solutions we roll out are suitable for their needs.
So I guess my final comment, Mr. Chair, if I may, is going beyond the meetings that we're going to have here, going beyond committee, looking at the report as well as the recommendations that we're going to bring forward, and looking beyond the response to the minister to continue in this process with the minister, as well as the group that we have here, and most importantly is the expectation that you as an airline, CATSA as a service provider, as well as the airport, how we can, again, end-to-end experience, a positive experience for the customer. And it's going to be fluid. It's not going to end tomorrow. We're not going to have all the answers. It is going to be fluid, but let's look forward to that. So that way, that customer does have that positive experience. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Barceau-Duval. À vous la parole, 2 minutes et demie.
Mr. Barceau-Duval, 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. For probably my last opportunity to ask you questions, I'd like to raise a topic that was also raised in the part of the meeting with the previous witness, Mr. Lukács, who in one of his comments mentioned that the enforcement of one fare per passenger or one seat per passenger was a policy that should be applied within Canada and also should be applied in all flights leaving or arriving in Canada. And unfortunately, it seems that in a lawsuit that occurred, Ms. Chung versus WestJet a few years ago, WestJet fought against that with the Canadian Transportation Agency, a person of reduced mobility who had to take up more than one seat, and WestJet didn't want to apply that policy. I'd like to know why WestJet does not want to apply that policy and continues to discriminate in its fare policy against people with reduced mobility.
So maybe just as a general comment, I agree it's confusing because there's different regulation for domestic and international flying. Now, domestic is always relatively easy to organize. Internationally, you always have to think the other end as well, because there are also other airlines that are flying, and you don't want to create another confusion, because when they fly on a Canadian airline, they have one service, and when they fly on a non-Canadian airline, they get another one. And if you have a code share and you have a Canadian ticket, but a foreign carrier, so it's actually getting pretty complex. So that's why we need standards on these things, and these standards need to be international.
Qu'est-ce qui vous empêche d'appliquer les mêmes standards sur vos avions qui vont à l'étranger?
What prevents you from applying the same standards internationally as in Canada on your airplanes?
So I think what we need is consistency. I'm not generally opposed to that. I'm just saying we need consistency, and once we go into international travel, we need to make sure that the consistency is not just on the Canadian airlines, but also on the other airlines, because otherwise it becomes very complex and very confusing for the guests. So, but I agree with you. This is a confusing item. But maybe maybe you can speak to more detail to that.
Indeed, I think you summed it up well, Alexis. The issue is, if you think, for example, we fly to Paris, but so does Air France, and it's very confusing for guests and difficult when there's a different rule for a WestJet flight versus an Air France flight versus our co-chair on an Air France flight. So this is where consistency is important, and we agree that to this point, the regulator has made the right decision, and we also support the ongoing discussion of this at forums like IATA.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Merci, Mr. Backrack. Next, Mr. Barceau.
Thank you, Mr. Backrack. Mr. Barceau-Duval, I mean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Picking up on that last point, I'm a little bit confused by the statement that it would be complex and confusing for the guests. The guests are the ones that are requesting that the one person, one fare rule be upheld on international flights. And I would come back to Mr. Barcelou-Devel's question, which is what is preventing WestJet from accommodating them on WestJet's flights to and from Canada?
I can just repeat what I said before. It's the consistency around across the entire system. So if someone books a WestJet ticket, but this is operated on an Air France flight, for instance, and Air France does not have this type of rule, then this is creating confusion, right? And then we may not be able to deliver. So therefore, if this is so it's confusing. I also think that a solution is needed on that, but this solution has to be an international standard and not a Canadian standalone solution.
Okay, it seems that WestJet is fighting this in court when it could actually be accommodating people on every flight where it's possible. But I'm going to move on quickly to another point. You've been forthcoming with the number of complaints received from people with disabilities who travel on your flights. Would you support changes to legislation that would require airlines to provide those statistics to the CTA so that there can be public transparency?
100%. I think transparency is super important in our industry, and we are ready to share all this information with the CTA. I would also request transparency in the other direction. The CTA has not always been super transparent about what kind of complaints there are and what status the complaints have that are sitting with the CTA. So I think transparency is definitely something that can be improved in the Canadian regulatory space, and we are ready to participate for those parts that we control.
Okay, well, I'll end on that note. I appreciate that response, and hopefully the committee can include a recommendation to ensure that Canadian law in that regard is consistent with the United States, where airlines are required to share their complaint data with the FAA so that there can be public transparency and it can be audited. I know one thing coming out of the Auditor General's work is the fact that there's limited transparency under the current regulations. And I think we would all look forward to that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And thank you, Mr. Backrack. Next, we have Mr. Stroll.
Sorry, just to recommend, so we provide this information when we ask, so we don't need to be regulated to provide it. So we are happy to share all this information with the public. So
we came here today to
thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Mr. Stroll. We're going to have to tighten the timeline a little bit, so I'll give you 3 minutes, sir.
Thank you. There was a CTA ruling that affected Air Canada, but it talked about, which is being appealed, it talked about the need for the airline to perhaps provide even different, with enough notice, to provide different aircraft to service someone who booked a ticket on a flight. I'm just wondering if you have considered that possibility, if someone who has a power chair, for instance, books a flight and the route is normally served by a Q400 aircraft. Are you envisioning a system where, with enough notice, WestJet would either voluntarily or be required to change equipment in order to accommodate that passenger getting to a destination that WestJet serves?
So generally, we always try to accommodate and find solutions. However, if this would be a regulatory requirement to always use an aircraft that has certain capabilities, this may become quite a challenge. So we have 7 airplanes, just 7, that are wide bodies and that have big cargo holds and big storage facilities within the passenger cabin. And if an issue happens in Fort McMurray, that's not an airport we can even fly these airplanes to. So there are limits that we can do, especially within the network that we are currently flying with our regional airplanes. So I think I understand the thought behind it, but I'm not sure whether it will entirely pass the practicability test.
Okay. A question I've had is what have your conversations been? Obviously you can't discuss internal discussions perhaps with your union partners, but with WestJet employees, obviously they're on the front lines of this often and are being asked, to perform a task that perhaps is not very common. Commonly, they would be loading suitcases, and then every once in a while have a very sensitive piece of equipment. Commonly, you'd be responsible for, service to guests on an aircraft, safety, but then every once in a while you have a very complicated case that presents itself. So, what are you working with Unifor and your other union partners to? Are they a part of this integrated system that you've come up with? And could you maybe describe how that relationship is, how you're addressing this with your union partners?
Yeah, 100%. We have a very constructive relationship with the unions, and we discuss all these type of things with the unions wherever it's appropriate. But let me just correct: it's not a rare thing. We have someone with some kind of disability on average on every single flight, and our team is passionate about helping these people and facilitating their travel. And the higher customer rating that we receive from people with disabilities compared to average passengers actually shows that this is actually working really, really well. There are always some mistakes that happen, but for the most part, this is actually working really well. And it's a great compliment to the tremendous effort of our team.
Can I just add one point as well? And we
Very quickly, Mr. Gibbons, if you can.
We've extended this invitation to many groups, but as part of your study, we welcome you to WestJet to meet with our teams who provide these services every day, to get that feedback from them and to hear their stories about the challenges, but also the respect and culture of care that we have. So as part of your study, we welcome you to WestJet to come and do that.
Thank you.
To come and listen and learn.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbons. We'll conclude our questioning today with Ms. Murray. And Ms. Murray, I'll turn the floor over to you. You have 3 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting conversation. I'm wondering, Mr. Hoensbroek, the 200 complaints, is that a trend in the right direction? What was the number of complaints, say, 2-3 years before?
Yeah, I'll address this one. We want those complaints to be lower and lower, and that is the ultimate goal of the work that we're undertaking, is to reduce that number. We would love it to be zero. That is probably not achievable, but we will keep pushing.
Okay, then my question is, what is the trend?
Over the last several years, of course, we've had the COVID pandemic and some disruption, but if we take those years aside, consistently low numbers of issues relative to the number of guests we serve with disabilities is a very, very consistent trend. And again, a trend we want to see reduce over time.
Could you tell us what percentage of WestJet's employees self-identify as persons with disabilities, please?
You have the number?
We'll have to report back.
Yeah, we have to report back. It's a fair share. So we are a very inclusive company, and so there are quite a few, but I don't have the exact number.
Okay, so I'm also interested in how many are in mid to high level executive positions. And well, here's another question you may be able to answer. Does WestJet have targets for how many persons with disabilities you will have as in your employee group? Do you have a target percentage?
I would have to get back on that. There are obviously very different type of employee groups that have certain limitations to what kind of disabilities can they actually accommodate. So if you think of pilots, there are limits of disabilities that would allow someone to be a pilot or a flight attendant.
Clearly.
But there are other groups where this is much easier. And those cases we are very open and very welcoming, and we do employ quite a few. But don't know the exact number, but I'm happy to report back.
Well, I'm asking this because part of the culture change that that we've done in the Government of Canada is to have explicit goals for recruitment of persons with disabilities. To, for example, go from 5.3% of the workforce in 2018 to 7% in 2025, because that's part of the culture of the current government's approach to public service. And then that means those people can help the organization serve people with disabilities much more effectively. So I'm also interested in what kinds of support you provide for your internal employees with disabilities in terms of services and equipment to make sure they can be effective regardless of their disability. Do you have an explicit program for that?
So first of all, we are a very diverse company. In all diversity dimensions, we are actually scoring relatively high. So I think we are doing a pretty good job in that sense. I like your proposal. It's certainly something we should look at. I'm not sure to what extent we have explicit targets.
Yeah, well, we're going to have to get back to you, Ms. Murray, on all of these counts, and we'll endeavor to do so. I should add that in our discussions with the Chief Accessibility Officer, this is a topic that she has raised with us and tabled with us, and it's on our working list of items to tackle with her, is to get to the point you make, rightfully so, around you need to have an employee group that represents the general population to understand things better.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbons. Thank you, Ms. Murray. Yes, Mr. Badaway.
Just on Ms. Murray's question, what I think the committee would be very interested in is those numbers. And Mr. Peterson, you mentioned the fact of they've been going one way versus the other, but if we can have those numbers provided to the committee, that would be very helpful. Yes.
Yeah, happy to do that.
And well, I'll go a step further. Not only complaint, but also incident. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Badaway. On behalf of all committee members, I want to express our gratitude once again to our three witnesses who have appeared before us today from WestJet. I wish you all a wonderful afternoon. This meeting stands adjourned.
Thank you.